Scripture reading this morning comes from, how's that? Sorry, Troy. Scripture reading this morning comes from Genesis 13. Genesis 13, the first 11 verses. And Abram went up out of Egypt, he and his wife and all that he had, and Lot with him into the south. And Abram was very rich in cattle, in silver, and in gold. And he went on his journeys from the south, even to Bethel, unto the place where his tent had been at the beginning, between Bethel and Ai, unto the place of the altar, which he had made there at the first. And there Abram called on the name of the Lord. And Lot also, which went with Abram, had flocks and herds and tents. And the land was not able to bear them, that they might dwell together. For their substance was great, so that they could not dwell together. And there was a strife between the herdmen of Abram's cattle and the herdmen of Lot's cattle. The Canaanite and the Perizzite dwelled then in the land. And Abram said unto Lot, Let there be no strife, I pray thee, between me and thee, and between my herdmen and thy herdmen, for we be brethren. Is not the whole land before thee? Separate thyself, I pray thee, from me. If thou wilt take the left hand, then I will go to the right. Or if thou depart to the right hand, then I will go to the left. And Lot lifted up his eyes, and beheld all the plain of Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere, before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, even as the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, as thou comest unto Zoar. Then Lot chose him all the plain of Jordan, and Lot journeyed east. And they separated themselves from one another. Abram dwelled in the land of Canaan, and Lot dwelled in the cities of the plain, and pitched his tent toward Sodom. But the men of Sodom were wicked and sinners before the Lord exceedingly. Most of us probably know how Lot's story ended up. Not all that great. The Bible makes note that Lot looked down the Jordan River Valley and saw how beautiful it was, how well watered it was, as opposed to many of the other places in Palestine, which are rugged, unable to irrigate for crops. Water, the resource, is sparse. And so the Jordan Valley looked spectacular. It'd be good to live there. It would be good for the flocks. Everything seemed to be good. And so the Bible says that Lot pitched his tent, his dwelling place, in the direction of Sodom. The next time that we find Lot, he's not only in the direction of Sodom, he's in the middle of it. The Bible tells us in the New Testament that he was sore vexed every day by the things that he saw. Not many of his family members made it out of the area when God rained famously fire and brimstone down upon Sodom and Gomorrah and the other cities of the plain as well. What appeared to be so good on the surface when Lot lifted up his eyes turned out so poorly. There's a continual theme in the Old Testament of what is seen. In Genesis chapter 3, it begins when Eve is tempted by Satan. She noticed that the fruit that he was talking about on that tree, that they were not to touch, it did look good. It was pleasing to the eyes, and it was good for food. And it had some other bonuses that went along with it as well. Satan told her that God won't let you eat of this tree because he knows that when you eat of this tree, you'll become like God. So what was seen turned out to be a whole lot more than what was bargained for. And what Lot lifted up his eyes and saw turned out to be a whole lot more than what he bargained for. And this theme continues throughout the scriptures. You'll find in the cautionary tales, although they're more than just tales, they're actual events of actual people, but in the cautionary tales, many lives, there are many people who saw what they thought was good or a good idea at the time, and it turned out to be worse than they could have ever imagined. Lot saw the well-watered plains of the Jordan River Valley, and he was mesmerized by it, impressed by it, went for it, and things didn't turn out so well. I want to suggest to us this morning that there are still well-watered plains out there in the world. The situation hasn't changed, and humanity hasn't changed at all. Since the days of the Garden of Eden, when Eve and then Adam with her saw what appeared to be a good thing and went after it and got far more than they bargained for, or the days of Lot in which he saw what appeared to be a very good thing, but turned out to be more than he bargained for. And we also can see any number of things in this world, and we think that they look good. They seem like maybe even the right thing to do. And they turn out to be more than we bargained for. This morning I'd like to share with you two of those. Two of those things that might be the well-watered plains of this world in which we're living today. And these principles would fit at any time, but they certainly fit our time. One of those well-watered plains that I think we need to be very careful about is other people's lives. Other people's lives. We lift up our eyes and we see the well-watered plains of other people's lives. It's been studied in recent times. Studies of young people have been done relative to depression, suicidal thoughts. And there have been some studies, although I don't know how definitive they are, but there have been numerous studies that have been done on whether or not any of that is connected to social media use and the unreasonable expectations that are often put on people, especially young people, because of what they see on social media. But what I want to suggest is that social media is merely an amplifier. Most of you know that I play guitar, and I like to play guitar through an amplifier because I like to make noise. And so the amplifier isn't the guitar, and it isn't the sound. It's not the product. It's just the thing that amplifies. And you can spend all day searching for the right equipment, and you can spend your whole life, and you usually do, trying to dial in some kind of tone that you really like. But at the end of the day, if you can't play the guitar, it really doesn't matter how much money you've spent on the amplification system. It's just going to be louder and louder junk. Social media, just like television media, or back in the day, radio, or whatever else kind of medium that is out there, is just another amplifier. An amplifier of what is good and an amplifier of what is evil. And young people are not the only ones that are subject to this issue. Paul was not writing to children when he was telling them, and he was writing to Christians, by the way, when he's telling them that they had to learn to be content. He was writing to legitimate, grown-up Christian people, telling them that you need to learn to be content with such things as you have. Be content with your life. The problem is all too human. We can go back even further with this issue than Paul's writings. We can go all the way back to the book of Exodus, for example, to the 10 commandments that were related to Israel. Was Israel going to have the problem of being surrounded by people that they could look at and say, wow, I think we'd really like to have that, or why don't we have one of those? Apparently so, because much of what God has to say in the 10 commandments revolves around covetousness. Coveting that which is not yours, coveting that which somebody else possesses or seems to be. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his male servant, or his female servant, or his ox, or his donkey, or lest we have to make this ad infinitum list, or anything that is your neighbor's. This is a human problem. The amplification systems are certainly there for this problem, and they always have been one way or another. But this is a human problem to look, to lift up our eyes and to see the well-watered plains of somebody else's life, or what appears to be somebody else's life. The stuff that they have, the educational attainments that they've achieved, the financial condition that they are in, whatever it is. And it's easy to be completely skewed about what that is, because the fact is, most of us really don't know what other people's lives are really like. And so we tend to see our own selves sometimes, and we compare ourselves to other people. And just as a practical matter, but also as a matter that can lead us into temptation and sin, God says, this is not the best way to live your life. This is not going to make you happy. It's going to make you miserable. In some cases, as again, I would refer back to some studies that have been done on particular cases in particular contexts, it can lead people, very impressionable people, to become severely depressed, even suicidal, because they think that their life is never going to be as good, or they are never going to be as good as their neighbor. Jesus said these words in Luke 12, "Take heed, beware of covetousness, for man's life does not consist in the abundance of things which he possesses." Paul tells us in Colossians 3 and verse 5, "Put to death covetousness." Put it to death, which is idolatry. In Hebrews 13 and verse 5, there's a phrase that we throw out quite often and quote, and I'm guilty of quoting it out of its context quite often. I know. Hebrews 13:5, "I will never leave thee nor forsake thee." But that verse begins this way: "Let your conversation be without covetousness." I noted when I was looking at this passage, there's a number of different translations of this passage, and I suppose all of them are good, and some of them are good in their own way. Some of them say something like, "Be careful about being greedy for money." Well, there is a sense in which covetousness can be specific to money. There's no doubt about that. But the term here is much broader than that. This term in the New Testament really reflects more of what is outlined back in the Ten Commandments in Exodus 20, verse 17. It's anything that ain't yours. Anything that you don't have a right to. It doesn't matter if it's money or somebody else's spouse or whatever. It's anything that doesn't belong to you, that you have no right to. So I think the King James translation has nailed this with the generality of the translation. It says, "Let your conversation," now it's a word we don't use in the same way today. It means your manner of life. "Let your whole life be without covetousness." Now that's an easy statement to say. That's not as easy of a statement to live up to. Let everything in your life be without the want for something you think somebody else has. That's not easy. But that's the admonition. Let your conversation be without covetousness, and be content with such things as you have. For he hath said, "I will never leave thee, nor forsake thee." There has to be a focus on gratitude in our lives for what God has blessed us with. There's a very real sense in which the cliche statements are true. They've become cliches because they are true. One of them is that you are exactly where God put you. The condition that you are in right now, God knows the position that you are in, and that's the position that God has put you in. That's not always easy to deal with, but that is the fact. There's another cliche that you hear a lot. It's been used in music. It's been used a lot of different ways. It's really not about having what you want. It's about wanting what you have. Are we satisfied? Are we truly satisfied with what God has blessed us with? If we're not truly satisfied with what God blessed us with, then when what God has blessed us with is taken away from us, we're going to have a much harder time assimilating that reality. Or when God blesses us with something beyond what we currently have, we're not going to know how to treat it. But when we are thankful for exactly what we have, and we have no expectation of it being any better or any worse, we're just thankful for what we have today, we can handle the situation when it changes. And we're not so inclined to look somewhere else and be discouraged about what's happening with us as opposed to what maybe we think is happening with somebody else. But this has to be learned. Paul said in Philippians chapter 4, not that I'm speaking in respect of want, and the reason why he says that is because the Philippians had determined to support him in some way, but up to that point, they hadn't been able to do it. And Paul says, listen, I know that you meant to do this and that you will do it, but I'm not saying that because I'm in need and you haven't supplied it. That's what the first statement is about. So not that I speak in respect of my needs, but he says, for I have learned in whatsoever state I am or condition, in it to be content. One paraphrase, not translation, but paraphrase, put it this way: I have learned to be satisfied with whatever I have. We must focus on gratitude for what God has blessed us with, how far God has brought us in our life, all the many things with which God has blessed us that certainly are outside of our deserving. And at the very least, when our circumstances feel to us to be completely out of our control, and we're greatly struggling, and we're asking for God to relieve us of those circumstances, the reality is sometimes He will. And sometimes He will say what He said to the Apostle Paul in 2 Corinthians 12, which is, my grace is sufficient for you. My strength is perfected in your weakness. So we need to be careful about lifting up our eyes to the well-watered plains of other people's lives and be more consistently focused on the gratitude for the life that God has given us. The second one that I want to share with you this morning is the well-watered plains of one's own feelings. Of one's own feelings. We're fully entrenched in an era of feelings. An era of feelings. I don't suppose this is the first period of time that is like that. This is an observational suggestion that I'm making to you that I have seen over the past, let's say, 35 years of my paying attention to anything. And one of the things that appears to be, to me, an observational reality is that we are in an age of the overindulgence of our personal feelings. This has a lot of applications. This is not a. I'm not looking down just one avenue. It has a lot of applications. But we're fully entrenched, I believe, in an era of feelings. Now, I don't know why this is. I've pondered this for quite some time and wondered what this is. And I have a terrible theory, but I'll share it with you anyway. About 100 years ago or so, people that I knew from that generation, turn of the century and maybe the first half of the 20th century, most of those people that were our Perhaps they were your parents or grandparents or great-grandparents, if you knew your grandparents and great-grandparents. We're a very stoic people for the most part. They didn't share feelings very easily. I might share the feeling of love with grandchildren or something like that. But as far as sharing feelings and emotional problems and things like that, you just didn't hear about that kind of thing. It wasn't common in my grandparents' era. And I don't know if this is a pendulum swing reaction to a lack of emotional healthiness from several generations, and now we've gone to the point where we want to deal with emotional health, and that's a very good thing, and we ought to do that. But I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about swinging the pendulum clear to the other side, as far as you can go, into the overindulgence of any feeling that anybody has, and validating any feeling. You know, the reality is, I've experienced a lot of feelings in my life, just like I suppose that you have as well. And sometimes those feelings turn out to be invalid. Sometimes they are valid. When they're valid, they need to be addressed. Sometimes those feelings are invalid. Let me give you an example of that. When I was a kid, I did a lot of really dumb things, but one of the things that I did was I remember very specifically going outside in the summertime and watching ants work. Now, this is going to sound crazy, and I reveal myself here a little bit, my mania, but as it were. I'm watching ants work, and I remember on one occasion, actually, it might have been the same occasion. Now, this I don't recall, but I remember thinking, well, they like sweet stuff, so I'm going to give them some gummy bears. And so I did. I went and took some gummy bears out, and I put it on the little ant hill, and then I came back and looked a little bit later, and it must have been a really hot day because it melted over the hole. And then I felt terrible because like, oh, I killed them. Anyway, these are the things that children do. But I remember watching the ants, and I remember thinking, you know, I want to know where they're going. I want to know what they're doing down there. I want to see. And I remember having this kind of overwhelming feeling as a child of how badly I wanted to become an ant, so I could get down there and crawl on the ground with those little ants and see where they were going. Now, I'm thankful I didn't grow up thinking, because I had such an affinity for ants, that I had to be an ant. I must be an ant. But it turns out those were kind of invalid feelings. They were cute feelings, but they were invalid. Of course, you can't be an ant. And at some point, that stark reality hit me, and I probably cried about it. I don't know. But I remember asking God if I could just be an ant for a day, just for a day, just so I could know what it was like. And you know what? He didn't indulge me. Not at all. And I learned better. Now, I know that's a bit of an extreme example. But I feel like in some respects we're living in an example or an era of time in which there's a lot of extreme feelings that are being overindulged. When people's feelings are overindulged, something important happens. Now, it's not important in a good sense. It's important in a negative sense. What happens when everybody's feelings are justified, everybody's personal feelings are indulged and validated, you eliminate the concept of absolute truth. Particularly moral truth. Now, if you're not a Christian, that's not a problem. Who cares? Eat, drink, tomorrow we die. If you're a Christian, that's a problem. Because we live by a standard, or we're supposed to, that is outside of ourselves. Do we have a moral aversion to truth right now in our society? Is it being borne along by an overindulgence and validation of personal feelings? Well, I can't prove it. I'm no scholar on the subject. I'm just giving you my observational so-called wisdom, but I don't think it's helping. Frank Turek often asked this question on college campuses, and if I could tell you the name of his website, if I could remember it, I would tell you, but I can't right at the moment. There's really good stuff on there too. Ask me later at some point and I'll tell you. He often asks college students when he does seminars and such and forums. He does a lot of open mic question and answer stuff. He asks a lot of the college students, he'll say, if Christianity was true, would you become a Christian? Aside from the argument that we're currently having, if you found out, if the evidence led to the reality that Christianity was true, would you become a Christian? Do you know what the majority of the answers come back are? No. That's not an aversion to intellect. It's not an aversion to evidence, not an aversion to truth. It's an aversion to moral responsibility. What it means to be a Christian is to have a moral responsibility that's higher than the self. It's higher than, it's outside of me, in fact. Now, I want to suggest to you that man never changes. Although this seems to be the season that we're currently in, man never changes. You can go back to the book of Judges and you can find 2 times in the book of Judges this theme is related to us. In those days, there was no king in Israel, and every man did that which was right in his own eyes. And you might think to yourself, I wonder what that must look like. All right, just walk out and live life. Interact with your coworkers and your neighbors. Turn on the television once in a while and you'll see every man living after that which is right in his own eyes. If what I feel is true, whether it's about myself, my nature, my sexuality, whatever it might be, if whatever I feel is true, then there is no objective truth. There's no objective reality. And by the way, as a consequence, if there is no objective reality, then there certainly is no God. And there certainly is no Christianity, except nominally speaking. It's a social club. If everyone's feelings are valid, then in one sense, nothing is valid. It's all the same. And this is why in the world people repeat things like, or will say things like, just let people live their lives, it doesn't matter. I understand that. That's not a false statement. Outside of Christ, not a false statement. As far as the world is concerned, you're absolutely right. It does not matter. It doesn't matter if you try to live by some moral code as your conscience dictates, as strictly as you want to, or if you're the worst profligate that ever lived. Outside of Christ, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter in the end. There's no absolute truth. So it doesn't matter. In one sense. So that's the age, that's why we're in an age of subjectivity rather than objectivity. Subject means within the self. Objectivity means within the object. Right? Here's objective truth. That's a bench. And it doesn't matter what I call it. It doesn't care what I call it. It's a bench whether or not I exist. It's a bench whether or not I like it. It's a bench whether or not I write on a piece of paper and say, it's a toad. Still not a toad. It's just a bench. That's what objective reality is. Subjective reality says, within the subject, me, it's whatever I say it is. Well, that's fine if there's no eternal consequence to the moral dilemma that this creates when you get into that realm. It sounds good. It sounds good for everybody to be right. But is it really? Is it better to live in the age of subjectivity than the age of objectivity? In an age of delusion rather than an age of reality? In an age of confusion rather than peace? In an age of chaos rather than an age of order? Oh, if I should say this, there's a guy that my wife deals with at work that literally, when he has mental issues, literally thinks he owns Walmart and tells them this, I own this place, and means it, absolutely. I mean, he needs help, but that's the point. He needs help. Nobody's indulging this reality. When he comes in and takes whatever he wants and says, I own this place. He really believes it. But do you think anybody's indulging this reality? No. Why should it be different with any other subject? Here's what it comes down to. It comes down to lordship. It comes down to authority. Someone will say, well, the Supreme Court says that we can do X, Y, and Z. Well, I got news for you. The Supreme Court is not the highest court that there is. Do you think it's possible, just at all possible, that the Supreme Court might actually make a ruling with regard to some matter of morality that's not in concert with God's will? Is that possible? Sure, it's possible. The Supreme Court's not the final say. Somebody says, yeah, but there was a case or there was a local situation or whatever. That's not the final authority. You can appeal that thing all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court can say that black is white and white is black. It doesn't make any difference. It doesn't make it so. The Supreme Court themselves in the Nuremberg Trial admitted when the Nazis that were tried for gassing Jews and brutally murdering Jews and many others, by the way. It wasn't just 6 million Jews, although it was. When they were held accountable for that and put on trial, the Chief Justice Jackson, who presided over that trial from the United States, the defense of the Nazis was, we're just following our law. It was our national law. And Jackson's statement was, you're being tried by a higher law. Higher, he said, than the provincial and the transient. It transcends time and space. It's not national law. It's not international law. You can't do that. Why? If we were just validating feelings, then we simply let the Germans go and say, oh, I didn't realize that that's how you felt. It's all good. That's not what happened. And that's not what the world wanted to happen either. Because in our heart of hearts, as human beings, we inherently know, as Charles Pew used to tell us when we were at school, he'd say, you can push anybody, even the staunchest of unbeliever, you can push anybody into a corner and force them to defend some objective standard of right and wrong. It's so true. Everybody knows it. I mean, there's a point at which everybody says, well, no, you can't do that to me. Or no, you can't just do that. Why? Why not? As we close this, I want to think about this idea of nobody being harmed by the validation of everybody's feelings. Someone says, well, as long as nobody's harmed, it's all good. Again, if you live in the world, it's about the highest standards you can get. Eat and drink tomorrow we die, and try not to hurt anybody in the process. Seems valid. Sounds pretty good. But let me ask a couple of questions about this as long as nobody's harmed matter. First of all, what kind of harm? What do you mean by harm? The additional follow-up question is, how would you define harm then? Does that mean as long as nobody gets a mark on their skin? Does that mean as long as nobody gets punched in the face, it's okay? Is that the harm? There's other kinds of harm other than physical harm. There's emotional harm. There's spiritual harm. There's societal cost. Who gets to define that? What harm is with regard to the validation of one's feelings and what ought to be permitted? Well, I can only preach to the choir here today and how the children of the kingdom ought to conduct themselves. I can't speak to much of what the world will choose to do, because that's within their right to do as they please, I suppose. The issue that I have, and the reason why I preach the sermon, is because I believe, that these attitudes do infiltrate the church. That Christian people can get pulled away and caught up in this way of thinking. Can become sympathetic to it and lose their bearings. Especially young people. So what's the societal cost? I'll tell you the societal cost. I'll tell you the real harm of what it's like for a society to live however it wants, throwing all rules to abandon, validating all feelings, and letting anybody simply choose whatever it is that they want to do. In Romans chapter 1, Paul says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, because it's the power of God unto salvation to everyone that believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. For in it is the righteousness of God. You want a just society? God's will is the only way to find it. In the gospel is God's righteousness revealed from faith unto faith, as it is written, the justified shall live by their trust in God, their faith. 4, verse 18 of Romans 1, the wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who, notice this word here, who hold the truth. That's an interesting word. It literally means to suppress something, to keep it down. I don't know if you remember the Peanuts cartoon, and then, of course, the television programs and all that. You remember Linus and Lucy, the brother and sister? Lucy was the older one and Linus was the younger one. And she hated that Linus was growing up. And so when she would walk by him, she'd push down on his head to keep him from getting any bigger. You know what unrighteousness does to the truth? Puts it under the water and tries to drown it. You stay down there. Well, as long as nobody's harmed. Well, what happens when truth has fallen in the streets and everyone lives by their own whim as long as nobody gets hurt? You see, when objective reality is gone and objective truth is gone and objective moral value is gone, the society is drowning. It's being plunged into darkness. What's going to happen to that society? Well, God's going to judge it. The wrath of God is poured out against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men. Who's paying the price for that? Well, all of us are going to pay the price for that now. And some are going to pay the price for that eternally. The suppression of truth leads to greater spiritual dysfunction. Well, what leads to the suppression of truth? The lack of moral objectivity, the indulgence of feelings, the lack of awareness or the lack of regard for an objective source of lordship outside of the self. That's why we say Jesus is Lord. And I hope that's the way that we live. And hopefully we can bring some others along with us as we go. There's well-watered plains out there. They look really good. Lift up your eyes and see them, the well-watered plains of other people's lives and the well-watered plains of one's own feelings, but it doesn't turn out the way that people think it does. It'll lead to ruin and destruction. It did for Eve, Adam. It did for Lot. And you can think of anybody else that you want to throughout biblical history. It certainly can happen to anybody in the world, and it certainly can happen to anybody who is a child of God. No doubt about it. And the moment you think it can't happen to you, it's going to happen to you. So be careful where we cast our eyes and keep ourselves focused on the Lord and His Lordship, and keep ourselves focused on gratitude for what God has blessed us with. And we'll stay out of those plains, and hopefully out of the destruction that goes with them. If there's someone here who's not a Christian, not a child of God this morning, we want to encourage you to obey the gospel of Christ. If you believe that Jesus is the Son of God and you're willing to confess your faith in Him today and repent of your past sins, you can put Him on today in baptism for the remission of all your past sins. Be buried with Him in baptism, rising to walk in newness of life. We'd love to help you on your journey today. And if you're a child of God and things aren't as they ought to be in your relationship with Him, we hope to encourage you to make things right. If we can help you in any way, won't you let us know as we stand and sing.